the scorching summer of 1859, an unrelenting heat wave gripped the hills of eastern Tennessee, transforming the landscape into a shimmering mirage of dust and despair. The air danced with waves of heat above the parched roads, driving weary men to seek refuge beneath the gnarled branches of ancient oaks, where time itself seemed to stall under the sun's fierce gaze. Crops wilted in the fields, livestock sought scarce shadows, and creek beds revealed smooth stones once cradled by cool currents. Old-timers muttered that this drought rivaled the brutal summer of '32, which had forced families westward in search of kinder lands. Yet for the Whitmore family, this oppressive heat was merely a prelude to a far greater ordeal. Time, that unyielding force marching ever forward without bias, was about to twist into something strange and terrifying, forever altering the lives of all 19 souls who called the Whitmore estate home. Our tale unfolds on that sprawling 300-acre haven, just 5 miles from the quiet town of Maplewood, Tennessee. A sprawling property of some 300 acres with fields of tobacco and corn stretching toward the distant Appalachian foothills. The main house stood proud against the backdrop of rolling hills, a grand 2-story structure of dark timber and white clapboard, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Tall windows, now thrown open in a futile attempt to catch any passing breeze, reflected the afternoon sun like watchful eyes. A pair of massive stone chimneys flanked the eastern and western ends of the house, standing silent in the summer heat, but promising warmth when winter would eventually return to the Tennessee highlands. The estate had not always been so impressive. Local stories told of how Jonathan Whitmore had arrived with little more than a wagon of possessions, a pregnant wife, and a vision of what might be possible in this fertile valley. The Whitmore land had been considered marginal by earlier settlers, too rocky in some places, too prone to flooding in others. But Jonathan had seen potential where others saw obstacles. Through sheer determination and an uncommon knowledge of agricultural practices he'd learned from his father in Virginia, he transformed the challenging landscape into one of the most productive farms in the county. Jonathan Whitmore had built this place with his own hands nearly 30 years prior when he first arrived from Virginia with his young bride, Eleanor. Now at 53, his hair had grayed at the temples, but his tall frame remained as sturdy as the oak beams that supported his home, weather-beaten from decades of working the land. His face was a map of fine lines that deepened when he smiled, which was often when surrounded by his ever-growing family. His hands were calloused and strong, hands that could break a wild horse to saddle or gently cradle a newborn grandchild with equal skill. Jonathan was a man of standing in the community, a landowner, a deacon at the local church, and the patriarch of what many considered the largest and most prosperous family in the county. He had risen from humble beginnings to become one of the wealthiest men in eastern Tennessee, though he wore his success with a modesty that endeared him to neighbors of all stations. His word was his bond, his handshake as binding as any written contract, and his judgment was often sought in matters of dispute among the farming families that populated the rolling hills surrounding Maplewood. The Whitmore household consisted of 19 souls in total. Jonathan and Eleanor had been blessed with 10 children of their own, 6 sons and 4 daughters, ranging in age from 31 to 11. 4 of the older children were married, bringing 3 daughters-in-law and 1 son-in-law into the fold. And then there were the 5 grandchildren, all under the age of 8. It was a boisterous household, especially when everyone gathered for Sunday dinner or special occasions. The dining room filled with the clatter of silverware, the overlapping conversations, and the laughter that seemed to be the Whitmore family's most abundant crop. The servants often remarked that keeping track of all the Whiters was like trying to count a flock of starlings in flight. Just when you thought you had accounted for everyone, another would appear from some unexpected corner of the house. But Eleanor Whitmore managed the busy household with practiced efficiency, having long ago developed systems for everything from laundry day to harvest festivals. The rhythm of life on the Whitmore estate moved with a comfortable predictability, the days flowing one into the next like the gentle Maple Creek that wound its way through the eastern edge of their property. Sarah pressed her face closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass despite the heat. At 11 years old, she had yet to adopt the more reserved manners expected of young ladies in 1859 Tennessee. Her dark hair escaped its ribbon confinement and wild tendrils that framed a face sprinkled liberally with freckles, a feature she had inherited from her mother, much to her ongoing dismay. Unlike her older sisters, who had learned to carry themselves with quiet dignity, Sarah was all movement and curiosity, her mind as quick as her feet. "Papa, the Hendersons have arrived," called Sarah, pulling back from the lace curtains of the front parlor. She twirled excitedly, her calico dress flaring out around her ankles. "And they've brought the twins. Can I go outside to meet them?" Jonathan looked up from the newspaper he'd been reading, the Richmond Inquirer, which arrived by post-coach twice weekly. Political tensions between North and South had been growing increasingly concerning, but today was for celebration, not worry. She darted from the parlor, her footsteps echoing through the high-ceiling hallway as she called for her mother. "Eleanor, the first guests are arriving," Jonathan announced as his wife entered the parlor, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. Despite approaching her 50th birthday, Eleanor Whitmore maintained much of the beauty that had first caught Jonathan's eye at a harvest dance 3 decades earlier. Her chestnut hair showed only the faintest threads of silver, and though childbearing had softened her once slender figure, she carried herself with the same grace that had made her the most sought-after young woman in her Virginia hometown. The contraption in question was the latest of 23-year-old Thomas Whitmore's inventions. The second youngest son had a mind that seemed to work differently from the rest of the family, always calculating, always creating. While his brothers had inherited their father's practical approach to agriculture and business, Thomas possessed an intellect that seemed to float above the everyday concerns of farm life. Drawn instead to questions about the fundamental nature of the physical world, his small bedroom was filled with journals containing sketches and calculations and shelves lined with scientific texts ordered at great expense from booksellers in New York and Boston. Much to his father's dismay, Thomas showed little interest in farming, preferring instead to spend his days crafting curious devices of brass and wood. His latest obsession was a mechanism he claimed could measure the passage of time more precisely than any clock. Jonathan had grudgingly allowed Thomas to convert a corner of the barn into a workshop, hoping that his son's peculiar interests might eventually yield something of practical value. But after several years of watching Thomas produce one strange, apparently useless device after another, Jonathan's patience was growing thin. Sarah found her brother hunched over a workbench in his corner of the barn, a pair of brass-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose as he made minute adjustments to what appeared to be an elaborate clock mechanism. Unlike his father and brothers, whose hands were roughened by farm work, Thomas's fingers were long and nimble, better suited to manipulating the tiny gears and springs of his inventions than to gripping a plow or an axe handle. His waistcoat pockets bulged with an assortment of small tools, pencil stubs, and folded scraps of paper covered in calculations. "Thomas," Sarah called, startling him enough that he nearly dropped the delicate component he was adjusting. "Mama says you're to come to the house right away. The Hendersons are here already, and Papa says there's to be no more tinkering today." Thomas sighed, carefully setting down his tools and removing his spectacles. "Tell Father I'll be along directly. I just need to secure this pendulum assembly before I leave it." Sarah skipped over to peer at the complex arrangement of brass, crystal, and wood that dominated her brother's workbench. "Is this your new invention? What does it do?" But today was special. Today, the entire Whitmore clan had gathered to celebrate Ella Laner's 50th birthday. Neighbors from miles around would be arriving throughout the afternoon for what promised to be the social event of the season. The kitchen was alive with activity. Hams roasting, pies cooling, and servants rushing to and fro under Eleanor's watchful eye. The rich aromas of cinnamon, cloves, and roasting meat permeated every corner of the house, temporarily overwhelming even the omnipresent summer heat. In the dining room, Jonathan's eldest daughter, Abigail, supervised the arrangement of Ella Laner's finest china and silverware, brought out only for the most special occasions. At 29, Abigail had inherited her mother's organizational skills along with her father's authoritative presence. Her husband, Charles Fletcher, a successful merchant from Knoxville, stood nearby, bouncing their youngest child on his hip while attempting to keep their 2 older children from touching the elaborately folded napkins. "Nath and Emily, if you cannot keep your hands to yourselves, "You shall be sent upstairs until the guests arrive," Abigail warned, her tone brooking no argument. The children immediately clasped their hands behind their backs, though mischievous grins suggested their compliance might be short-lived. In the front parlor, Eleanor's sister-in-law, the widowed Catherine Whitmore, arranged fresh-cut flowers from the garden in crystal vases. At 62, Catherine had been living with the family since the death of her husband, Jonathan's brother, 5 years earlier. Her presence was a blessing to Eleanor, who valued both the practical help with household management and the companionship of another woman close to her own age. The two had become as close as blood sisters over the years, sharing the joys and sorrows that came with overseeing a large, bustling household. "These dahlia are particularly fine this year," Catherine remarked, placing a vibrant bloom at the center of an arrangement. "Despite the heat, your garden continues to flourish." "A credit belongs to Matthew and his green thumb," Eleanor replied, referring to her third son, who at 27 had taken charge of the estate's ornamental gardens. Unlike Thomas with his scientific obsessions, Matthew's interests lay in the practical cultivation of plants. Both for beauty and for the medicinal herbs, he studied with almost scholarly dedication. "Though I fear if this drought continues, even his talents won't save the late summer blooms." Outside, the two youngest Whitmore grandchildren, cousins Elizabeth and Daniel, aged 4 and 5 respectively, chased each other around the ancient oak tree that dominated the side yard, their excited squeals piercing the afternoon quiet. Their mothers, both busy with preparations, had assigned 12-year-old Samuel, Eleanor's grandson, the task of watching the younger children, a responsibility he approached with comical seriousness, hands on hips, as he called warnings about straying too far from the house. As the Henderson family's carriage rolled up the long gravel drive, none of the Whiters could have possibly imagined that this day would mark the beginning of a nightmare, a terrifying ordeal that would later be whispered about in hushed tones throughout the county for generations to come. The celebration was in full swing by mid-afternoon. Tables had been arranged beneath the ancient oak trees in the side yard, laden with enough food to feed half the county. Several whole hogs had been roasting since before dawn in pits dug specially for the occasion, their succulent meat now being carved by Jonathan's second eldest son, Michael, whose skill with a carving knife was renowned throughout the region. Platters of fried chicken, bowls of fresh churned butter, baskets of cornbread, and turkey nests of summer vegetables harvested that very morning from the Whitmore gardens covered every available surface. For the sweet-toothed guests, there were pies of every description: apple, peach, blackberry, and Eleanor's famous sweet potato pudding, a closely guarded recipe passed down from her grandmother. Crystal bowls of fresh turned ice cream kept cold in tubs of ice hauled from the Whitmore ice house were being rapidly depleted despite their generous size. A small group of musicians, a fiddler, a banjo player, and a man with a squeeze box, played lively tunes while couples danced on a wooden platform Jonathan and his sons had constructed for the occasion. The music competed with the steady hum of conversation and laughter as neighbors, who often went weeks without seeing each other, caught up on local news and gossip. Eleanor Whitmore moved among her guests with the grace of a woman half her age. Time had been kind to her. Her face showed fewer lines than most women who had borne 10 children, and only a few strands of silver threaded through her dark hair, which was arranged in an elegant shiny. Her birthday dress, a gift from Jonathan, was made of fine indigo silk with delicate white lace at the collar and cuffs, an extravagance that had required ordering fabric from as far away as New York City 6 months in advance. Unlike many women of her station who maintained a certain aloof dignity, Eleanor possessed a warmth that made even the humblest tenant farmer's wife feel welcome in her presence. She remembered details about everyone's families, asked after ailing relatives, and genuinely cared about the answers. It was this quality, perhaps more than any other, that had earned the Whites the respect and affection of the entire community. "A wonderful gathering, Mrs. Whitmore," remarked Reverend Caldwell, the minister of Maplewood's Presbyterian Church, as Eleanor paused near the lemonade table. A portly man with mutton chop whiskers and kind eyes. Reverend Caldwell had served the spiritual needs of Maplewood for nearly 20 years. "The Lord has truly blessed your household." Eleanor smiled warmly, accepting the compliment with practiced modesty. "Indeed, he has, Reverend, though I confess, Keeping track of all 19 of us can be quite the task. Sometimes I feel I need eyes in the back of my head just to know what the younger ones are up to." She glanced fondly toward where Sarah was attempting to teach a complicated dance step to the Henderson twins, her dark curls bouncing with each energetic movement. "Children are the Lord's greatest blessing," the Reverend agreed, his gaze following Eleanor's. "And grandchildren even more so, they say that they are," Eleanor replied. "Though I sometimes wonder if the Lord didn't bless us with quite such abundance to keep us humble." Just yesterday, young Daniel decided to release all the chickens from their coop because he felt they looked sad. "We spent the better part of the afternoon rounding them up from every corner of the property." The Reverend chuckled appreciatively, but before he could respond, a sharp cry cut through the festive atmosphere. "Mother!" The sharp call came from Abigail, Eleanor's eldest daughter, who at 29 was herself the mother of 2 young boys. She was hurrying across the lawn, supporting the slumping form of Sarah, whose face was alarmingly flushed. The girl's normally boundless energy seemed to have vanished completely. She leaned heavily against her sister, her steps faltering. "She just collapsed during the dancing," Abigail explained, her voice tight with concern as she guided Sarah toward a nearby chair. One moment she was laughing and twirling with the Henderson children, and the next she simply crumpled to the ground. "I thought perhaps she had twisted her ankle. But she's burning up, Mother. She's burning up like she has a fever." Eleanor pressed a hand to Sarah's forehead and drew back in alarm. The child was indeed unnaturally hot, her skin almost painful to touch. Sarah's eyes, usually so bright and alert, had taken on a glassy, unfocused quality, and her breathing came in short, irregular gasps. "It came on so suddenly," Abigail continued, her own face pale with worry. "She was fine just minutes ago. You saw her yourself." Eleanor quickly assessed her youngest child's condition with the practiced eye of a mother who had nursed 10 children through various illnesses over the years. This was no ordinary summer heat exhaustion. The speed with which the symptoms had manifested was deeply concerning. Jonathan Eleanor called to her husband, who was deep in conversation with the town Dr. Isaiah Fleming near the edge of the gathering. "Jonathan, Sarah's taken ill." Dr. Fleming, a man in his early 50s with a well-trimmed beard going to silver and the weathered complexion of someone who spent much of his time traveling between remote farmsteads, responded immediately to the urgency in Eleanor's voice. He crossed to Sarah's side in long strides, medical bag already in hand. "Let's get her inside out of this heat," he instructed, his professional demeanor taking over. "Can she walk?" "I think so," Abigail replied, helping Sarah to her feet. The girl swayed dangerously but remained upright with her sister's support. "I'm just dizzy, Mama," Sarah protested weakly. "I don't want to miss the party." "There will be other parties, child," Eleanor soothed, stroking her daughter's flushed cheek. "Right now, you need to rest." Several guests had begun to take notice of the commotion, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern as they observed Sarah's obvious distress. Eleanor, ever conscious of her duties as hostess, turned to address them. "Please continue enjoying yourselves," she urged with a reassuring smile that belied her growing worry. "It seems the excitement and heat have overwhelmed Sarah a bit. Dr. Fleming will see to her, and I'm sure she'll be right as rain before long." "It's unusual," Dr. Fleming muttered, more to himself than to the anxious parents hovering nearby. "Such a sudden onset. No cough, no signs of infection." He peered into Sarah's eyes, then frowned. Her pupils are strangely dilated. Sarah starred restlessly on the bed, her small hands plucking at the coverlet. "It hurts, Mama," she whimpered, her voice thin and frightened. "My skin feels like it's on fire, and there's a strange pulling sensation inside me, like I'm being stretched." Eleanor exchanged a worried glance with her husband before turning back to their daughter. "Where does it hurt, sweetheart?" she asked, keeping her voice calm despite her growing fear. "Everywhere," Sarah replied, a tear slipping down her flushed cheek. "But especially my bones. They ache so strangely." Dr. Fleming's frown deepened at this description. In his 25 years of practicing medicine in rural Tennessee, he had encountered most of the common ailments that afflicted the population. From seasonal influenzas to typhoid, from childhood diseases to the injuries common in an agricultural community. But Sarah's symptoms matched none of the familiar patterns. "Will she be all right?" Ella asked, clutching her husband's arm so tightly that her knuckles whitened. Jonathan placed his hand over hers, offering what comfort he could while maintaining his outward composure. The doctor straightened, tucking his stethoscope into his black leather bag. "I believe it's just a summer fever," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Keep her cool, plenty of water, and she should improve by morning. I'll leave some powders for the pain." Jonathan followed Dr. Fleming into the hallway, closing the bedroom door softly behind them to allow Eleanor some privacy with their suffering child. "You don't sound convinced of your own diagnosis, Isaiah," he said quietly, using the doctor's first name, as was their custom when speaking privately. The two men had known each other since boyhood, having grown up on neighboring farms before Jonathan moved west to establish his own homestead. Dr. Fleming hesitated, running a hand through his graying hair. "I've never seen a fever come on so suddenly, nor with quite this constellation of symptoms." He admitted the dilated pupils, the bone pain. She describes, "It's unusual, but then the human body is full of mysteries, even to those of us who've spent decades studying it." "Should we be concerned about contagion?" Jonathan asked, thinking of the dozens of guests still enjoying the celebration outside, unaware of the disco that had taken root inside the house. "Should we send everyone home?" The doctor considered this for a moment. "I see no evidence that it's contagious. More likely, it's a unique reaction to the heat, perhaps compounded by excitement or something she ate. Keep an eye on the others, of course, but I see no reason to cause alarm by ending the gathering prematurely." Jonathan nodded, relieved. "Thank you, Isaiah. I'll have James drive you back to town after supper, unless you'd prefer to stay." "I should return to my other patients," the doctor replied. "But send for me immediately if her condition worsens, or if anyone else begins showing similar symptoms." "Mother," exclaimed Rebecca, Ella daughter-in-law, who had been helping to pack away the leftover food. She rushed to Eleanor's side, supporting her elbow. "Are you unwell?" Eleanor tried to wave away the concern, embarrassed by her moment of weakness. "Just a touch of fatigue, dear. It's been a long day." But even as she spoke, Ella recognized the telltale signs that had preceded Sarah's collapse. The sudden burning sensation beneath her skin, the peculiar ache deep in her bones, the strange clouding of her vision that made the familiar kitchen seem momentarily foreign. With a sinking heart, she realized that whatever had stricken her youngest daughter and grandson had now taken hold of her as well. "Perhaps it's something you ate," Jonathan suggested as he helped his wife to a chair, his face lined with worry. Though he tried to keep his tone light, the fear in his eyes betrayed his true concern. "The chicken may have turned in this heat. The chicken was fresh this morning," Ella replied weakly. Accepting the glass of water, Rebecca pressed into her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she raised it to her lips. Fleming had barely taken time to dress properly, arriving at the Whitmore estate with his waistcoat unbuttoned and his medical bag hastily packed. "I've never seen a fever spread so quickly," he admitted after examining each patient. The concern that had been merely a shadow in his expression earlier in the day had deepened into frank worry. He pulled Jonathan aside in the upstairs hallway, speaking in low tones to avoid being overheard by the family members who moved anxiously between sick rooms carrying cool water and fresh linens. "Keep them isolated from the others if possible. I fear it may be contagious." "Contagious?" Jonathan repeated the word, hanging ominously in the air between them. "What manner of illness do you suspect?" The doctor shook his head, frustration evident in the gesture. "That's what troubles me. It resembles no contagion I've encountered in my practice. The sudden onset, the peculiar constellation of symptoms. It's as though their bodies are somehow accelerating. The pulse is too rapid, respiration elevated beyond what even a high fever would explain, and the pain they describe." He broke off, seeming reluctant to continue. "What about the pain?" Jonathan pressed, his normally commanding voice reduced to a tense whisper. "They all describe it the same way," Fleming replied. "A sensation of being stretched from within, almost as though their very cells are being pulled apart. He sighed heavily. I've sent for a colleague in Nashville who specializes in unusual maladies. Until he arrives, we can only treat the symptoms and hope this runs its course quickly. After the doctor departed, having left additional powders for pain and fever, Jonathan Whitmore stood alone on the porch long after the sound of Fleming's carriage had faded into the distance. The night was still, except for the chorus of cicadas and the occasional hoot of an owl from the woods beyond the fields. The moon hung full and bright in the cloudless sky, casting the Whitmore estate in a silvery light that made it appear almost otherworldly. A sense of foreboding had settled over Jonathan, as tangible as the night air against his skin. In 30 years of farming this land, he had seen his share of illness, the usual childhood diseases, the occasional outbreak of influenza, even a brush with typhoid some years back. But something about this felt different, unnatural somehow. He was still standing there when the first light of dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the landscape in shades of gold and rose. The fields, still wet with dew, shimmered in the early light, and bird song replaced the night chorus of insects. The beauty of the familiar scene stood in stark contrast to the dread that had settled in Jonathan's chest during his night-long vigil. It was Thomas who found him, emerging from the house with a cup of steaming coffee. Despite having been among those stricken the previous night, Thomas appeared to have recovered somewhat, at least enough to be up and moving about. He had dressed in his usual attire of dark trousers and waistcoat, though he'd foregone his jacket in concession to the heat that promised to be as oppressive as the day before. "Father," Thomas said, offering the cup, "you should rest. James and I can manage things today." Jonathan turned, grateful for the coffee, but startled visibly at the sight of his son. The cup trembled in his hand, sloshing the hot liquid dangerously close to the rim. "Thomas, what's happened to your face?" Thomas blinked in confusion, running a self-conscious hand over his cheeks and jawline. "Nothing, Father. I'm fine now. The fever broke around 3. He gave a reassuring smile. "Whatever struck us yesterday seems to have passed, at least for me, though Mother and Sarah are still quite unwell." "Your face," Jonathan repeated, reaching out to touch his son's cheek with weathered fingers that now trembled slightly. "You look older." It was subtle but undeniable. Lines had appeared at the corners of Thomas's eyes and mouth that hadn't been there the day before. His skin seemed less taut, his expression somehow more weathered. Most disturbing of all, the faint beginnings of crow's feet that had just begun to show around his eyes, appropriate for a man of 23, had deepened overnight into the more pronounced lines of a man approaching his mid-30s. "Nonsense," Thomas dismissed with a laugh, though it sounded forced even to his own ears. "It's just the poor light and lack of sleep." But his hand moved unconsciously to his face, fingers tracing the unfamiliar contours. Then, more seriously, "Do I truly look different, Father?" Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving his son's face. "As though you've aged a decade in a single night." Thomas's scientific mind immediately began to race with possibilities, none of them comforting. "I must see for myself," he murmured, more to himself than to his father. He turned abruptly and strode back toward the house, Jonathan following close behind. In the entrance hall, a large mirror hung between portraits of Jonathan's parents. Thomas stopped before it, coffee forgotten in his hand as he stared at his reflection with growing horror. The face that looked back at him was recognizably his own, and yet subtly, terrifyingly altered. The youthful softness of his features had given way to sharper angles. A faint line had formed between his brows, the kind that comes from years of concentration, not a single night of fever, and was that a touch of gray at his temples that hadn't been there before. "This is impossible," Thomas whispered, setting down the coffee cup on a nearby table with a hand that now visibly shook. Inside the house, others were noticing similar changes. Eleanor gasped when she caught her reflection in her vanity mirror. The silver threads in her hair seemed to have multiplied overnight, and fine lines now radiated from the corners of her eyes like spiderwebs spreading across her once smooth skin. Her hands, as she raised them to her face in disbelief, showed pronounced veins, and the first hints of age spots that had not been present when she'd fallen asleep. "Jonathan," she called when her husband entered their bedroom, her voice thin with fear. "Look at me. Something is happening." Jonathan crossed to his wife, taking her trembling hands in his. He had known Eleanor for 30 years, had watched her age gracefully from a vibrant young bride to a dignified matron. He knew every line of her face, every strand of her hair. The woman before him now was still his Eleanor, but altered in a way that should have taken years, not hours. "I know," he said softly. "Thomas has been affected as well, and the others." Eleanor nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Catherine looks. She looks as though she's aged 20 years overnight." And Sarah, her voice broke. "Our little girl, Jonathan. She's changing before my eyes." In the next room, 11-year-old Sarah Whitmore sat on the edge of her bed, staring down at her body in bewilderment. Her nightgown, which had fit perfectly the day before, now felt tight across her chest and too short at the ankles. When she had awakened that morning, disoriented and still feverish, she had noticed immediately that something was wrong. Her limbs felt longer, unfamiliar. Her face, when she touched it, had seemed different somehow. The roundness of childhood giving way to the more defined contours of adolescence. Sarah had always been impatient to grow up, to be taken seriously like her older sisters, but not like this. Not in a way that made her bones ache and her skin feel like it didn't quite belong to her anymore. "Papa," she called anxiously when she heard her father's heavy footsteps in the hallway outside her room. "Papa, something's wrong with me." The Whitmore estate, normally so full of life and activity, had taken on the hushed, anxious atmosphere of a hospital ward. The affected family members were gathered in the main house, some confined to beds, others well enough to move about, but visibly aging with each passing hour. The unaffected few moved between them, offering what comfort and care they could, though conventional remedies seemed woefully inadequate against this unconventional affliction. In the kitchen, Mary Whitmore, James's wife, 7 months pregnant with their second child, prepared broth and tea for the ailing family members. At 29, Mary had been a nurse before her marriage, tending wounded soldiers returning from conflicts with Mexico. Those skills were now desperately needed as she coordinated the care of 14 afflicted whiters, assigning tasks to the few servants who hadn't fled in fear of the mysterious malady. "More willow bark tea for Mother Eleanor," she instructed a nervous housemaid, pressing a steaming cup into her hands. "And check if Catherine needs another cool compress. Her fever seemed to be rising again when I last checked." The maid nodded, but her eyes darted fearfully toward the door, as if calculating the distance to freedom. Mary couldn't blame her. What was happening in the Whitmore household defied natural law. It was terrifying to witness, even for someone with medical training. Dr. Fleming returned, bringing with him a younger colleague from Nashville who claimed expertise in unusual maladies. Dr. Edward Harlow was a slender man in his 30s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the intense gaze of someone who had spent more time with books than with people. He carried a leather satchel that clinked with glass vials and mysterious instruments as he moved. "I've never encountered anything like this," the Nashville doctor confessed, wiping his spectacles with a handkerchief. "The accelerated aging, it defies medical explanation." "Drive E." Fleming placed a steadying hand on his friend's shoulder. "Jonathan, I understand your frustration, but we're in uncharted territory here. Whatever this is, it's beyond anything in our medical experience." A soft knock at the study door interrupted their conversation. It was Thomas, now appearing closer to 35 than his actual 23 years. Despite his condition, he had spent the day moving between the sick rooms, offering comfort to his suffering family members while making careful observations of their symptoms and progression. "May I join you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice carrying a new gravity that matched his altered appearance. "I believe I might have some insight to offer." Jonathan nodded, gesturing for his son to enter. "Thomas, this is Dr. Harlow from Nashville. He's been assisting Dr. Fleming with diagnosing whatever this is." Thomas acknowledged the introduction with a nod, but wasted no time on pleasantries. "I've been monitoring the progression in each affected individual," he explained, producing a small notebook filled with precise handwriting. and what appeared to be mathematical calculations. Based on my observations, we're experiencing a consistent rate of accelerated aging, approximately 1 year of physical aging for every 24 hours of elapsed time. Dr. Harlow's eyebrows rose above his spectacles. That's a remarkably precise assessment. How did you determine this measurement and observation? Thomas replied simply, I've been documenting visible changes, hair graying, skin elasticity, even subtle shifts in bone structure and posture. The pattern is consistent across all affected individuals regardless of their starting age. Then perhaps the explanation isn't medical, Thomas suggested from his sickbed. Despite his condition, his mind remained sharp. With the family in crisis, Thomas hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. His eyes, which had always possessed a certain intensity when he was deep in thought, now seemed to hold a new wisdom, a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before his transformation began. I've been working on something, a device related to time, a way to measure it more precisely, but also to understand its fundamental nature. Your contraption in the barn, Jonathan scoffed, though there was more fear than derision in his tone. Now, what could that possibly have to do with this illness? Thomas met his father's gaze steadily. It's not just a timepiece, Father. It's an experiment in the manipulation of temporal energy. I've been corresponding with a scientist in Europe who theorizes that time isn't just a measurement, but an actual force that can be harnessed, perhaps even altered under the right conditions. A heavy silence fell over the room. Even the doctors exchanged skeptical glances, though Dr. Harlow's expression held a hint of fascination beneath the doubt. You're suggesting that your device has somehow caused this acceleration of time within living bodies? Dr. Fleming asked, his tone making it clear how preposterous he found the idea. I'm suggesting it's a possibility we can't dismiss, Thomas replied calmly. 3 nights ago, I completed the final calibrations on my device. 2 nights ago, I ran the first full-scale test. Yesterday, the symptoms began to manifest. The timing is suggestive. Jonathan's expression darkened as the implications of his son's words sank in. If Thomas was right, if his experiment had somehow caused this nightmarish situation, then the responsibility for the suffering of 14 family members rested squarely on Thomas's shoulders. The thought sent a surge of anger through Jonathan, momentarily displacing his fear. Are you saying that your reckless experimentation has endangered this entire family? He demanded, his voice rising. That while I've worked all my life to build something that would protect and provide for the Whiters, you've been playing with forces you don't understand, putting everyone at risk. Thomas flinched visibly at the accusation, but held his ground. I didn't know this could happen, Father. I still don't know for certain that my device is responsible. But if it is, then I might also be able to reverse the effects. Show me, Jonathan finally said, his voice cold with suppressed fury. Show me this device of yours. The 4 men made their way across the sun-baked yard toward the barn, their long shadows stretching before them in the late afternoon light. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and livestock, though the animals seemed unusually restless, shifting nervously in their stalls as the humans passed. The barn stood 100 yards from the main house, a large structure that housed not only the farm equipment and livestock, but also Thomas's workshop in a converted stall. The afternoon sun streamed through gaps in the wooden walls, casting strips of golden light across the hay-strewn floor and illuminating dust motes that danced in the beams. Thomas moved differently now. His previously energetic stride had become measured, his shoulders slightly stooped. In just 1 day, he appeared to have aged a decade, his body conforming to the new apparent age that his face displayed. The workshop was cluttered with tools, books, and half-finished inventions. Shelves lined one wall holding jars of mysterious substances, coils of wire, and various mechanical components salvaged from discarded machinery. A large workbench occupied the center of the space, its surface scarred from years of use. Detailed sketches and diagrams were pinned to every available vertical surface, many showing aspects of what appeared to be elaborate clockwork mechanisms. But dominating the center of the space was a device unlike anything Jonathan had ever seen. A complex arrangement of brass gears and crystal rods surrounded what appeared to be a large pendulum suspended over a circular base inscribed with strange symbols. The entire apparatus stood about waist-high with an intricate clockwork mechanism visible beneath a glass dome at its center. The brass components gleamed in the filtered sunlight, giving the device an almost magical appearance. Beautiful, but somehow disconcerting in its alien complexity. "I completed it 3 days ago," Thomas explained, his voice raspier than before. He approached the device with reverence, running his fingers lightly over the brass housing. "I've been running experiments each night. The crystals focus energy from the earth itself, while the pendulum creates a harmonic resonance that, according to my calculations, should interact with the flow of time." Dr. Harlow approached the device with unconcealed fascination, adjusting his spectacles as he peered at the intricate mechanisms. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he murmured, bending to examine the pendulum more closely. "But surely you don't actually believe this machine can affect the passage of time that violates every known law of physics?" "Every known law," Thomas emphasized. "But our understanding of time is still in its infancy. Newton treated time as absolute, a constant that flows uniformly throughout the universe. But my research suggests that time might be more malleable than we've believed, especially when subjected to certain energetic frequencies." "This is preposterous," Dr. Fleming declared, his medical rationality offended by such talk. "You can't possibly believe this contraption is causing people to age prematurely." "I don't know what to believe anymore," Thomas replied with a weary honesty that seemed to belong to a much older man. "But last night, something unusual happened during my experiment. There was a surge of energy. The crystals glowed brighter than I've ever seen, and the pendulum began to swing on its own. I tried to shut it down, but it continued operating for nearly an hour before finally stopping." As Thomas spoke, Jonathan noticed something he hadn't before. A faint humming emanating from the device just at the threshold of hearing. The sound seemed to vibrate, not just in his ears, but somehow within his very bones, creating an unsettling sensation of dissonance. He took an involuntary step backward. Dr. Fleming had been examining the device with cautious curiosity, his initial skepticism giving way to a more thoughtful consideration as Thomas explained the principles behind his invention. "These symbols," he said, pointing to the base. "Where did they come from? They don't resemble any writing system I'm familiar with." "From a book I acquired from a traveler passing through last autumn," Thomas explained. "A strange man with an accent I couldn't quite place. He claimed it contained ancient wisdom about the nature of time. Most of it was indecipherable, but these symbols were clearly meant to be arranged in this specific pattern." Thomas retrieved a slim leather-bound volume from a nearby shelf and opened it to a marked page. The paper was yellowed with age, covered in flowing script interspersed with diagrams and symbols that matched those on the base of the device. The text itself appeared to be in multiple languages, some recognizable as Latin or Greek, others completely alien. "The man who sold it to me claimed it dated back to ancient Babylon, though portions were added later by scholars throughout history. He said it contained secrets about the malleable nature of temporal reality that had been suppressed by various authorities throughout the ages." Jonathan felt a chill despite the heat of the barn. "Destroy it," he said suddenly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Take it apart right now." "Father," Thomas began to protest. "I don't care what we don't know." Jonathan's voice rose, echoing off the barn's high ceiling. 14 members of this family are aging before our eyes like fruit left in the sun. If there's even a chance this abomination is responsible, I want it dismantled." Dr. Harlow cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitmore, while I understand your concern, I must point out that if Thomas's device is indeed the cause of this phenomenon, destroying it without understanding its workings might leave us with no way to reverse the effects." Thomas seized on this reasoning. "Exactly, Father. We need to study it to understand what went wrong." He gestured to the book and his own notebooks. "If I can determine how the device accelerated time for the affected family members, I might be able to reconfigure it to reverse the process." Jonathan looked as though he might protest further, but then his shoulders sagged in defeat. The logic was sound. however much he might wish to simply destroy the source of their troubles and be done with it. Very well, but I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with. No more secrets, Thomas. Thomas looked as though he might protest further, but then his shoulders sagged in defeat. Very well, but I should document everything first. If we're to have any hope of reversing the effects, we need to understand exactly how it works. You have until sundown, Jonathan declared. Not a minute more. As they returned to the house, Jonathan noticed Mary standing on the porch, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. At 7 months pregnant, she had been spared the mysterious affliction thus far, but her face was drawn with worry for her husband and son, who remained healthy, and for her brother-in-law Thomas, who now looked closer to 35 than 23. The summer breeze lifted tendrils of her light brown hair, which she had pulled back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Any change? Jonathan asked as he approached. Mary shook her head, unconsciously stroking her rounded abdomen in the protective gesture common to expectant mothers. None for the better. Eleanor is resting, but she hesitated, reluctant to cause additional distress. Jonathan, her hair is almost completely gray now, and Sarah, little Sarah, looks like a young woman, not a child. Jonathan nodded grimly, having already witnessed these disturbing transformations. The doctors are still with us, and Thomas believes his device in the barn may be connected to what's happening. Mary's eyes widened. His invention. But how could a mechanical device affect human aging? I don't pretend to understand it, Jonathan admitted. Thomas speaks of temporal energy and other concepts beyond my comprehension. But if he's right, there may be hope of reversing the effects. Mary's hand tightened on the porch railing. And if he's wrong, Jonathan had no answer for that question. He simply covered her hand with his own, offering what comfort he could through his presence. Inside, the house had taken on the hushed atmosphere of a sick room. Curtains were drawn against the harsh afternoon sun, and the usual sounds of a busy household had been replaced by whispered conversations and occasional moans of discomfort. The servants moved quietly through the halls, carrying water, clean linens, and the medicinal teas that Dr. Fleming had prescribed. Though everyone now understood that conventional remedies were unlikely to affect whatever strange malady had befallen the Whitmore family, Jonathan made his way to the bedroom he shared with Eleanor. She lay propped against pillows, her eyes closed, her breathing steady, but the woman before him was shockingly altered from the one who had celebrated her 50th birthday just 2 days prior. Her once dark hair was now predominantly silver, the lines on her face deeper, more pronounced. Even her hands, resting atop the quilt, showed the prominent veins and slight tremor of advancing age. For a moment, Jonathan simply stood in the doorway, his heart constricting painfully at the sight of his beloved wife, transformed so cruelly by whatever force had been unleashed. Then he crossed to her side, taking one of those hands in his. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Her eyes fluttered open. They at least remained unchanged, the same warm brown that had captured his heart 3 decades ago. But now they were surrounded by a web of fine lines, and the whites had taken on a slightly yellowish tinge that spoke of advancing years. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice frail, but still carrying the gentle strength that had sustained their family through good times and bad. "You've been to see Thomas's device?" He nodded, stroking her hand. "Yes, he believes it may be responsible for what's happening to you all." "I thought as much," Eleanor said, surprising him at his questioning look. She continued, "A mother knows her children, Jonathan. Thomas has always been different, seeing things the rest of us couldn't see, understanding things beyond our grasp." A faint smile touched her lips. "Remember when he was just 7 and he built that water wheel for the creek? How he explained to us about energy transfer and mechanical advantage using words no child should have known." Jonathan remembered. Even then, Thomas had shown signs of the brilliant, if unconventional, mind that would set him apart from his more practical siblings. "He thinks he can reverse it," Jonathan told her. "He's working on it now." "Good," Eleanor murmured. "I have faith in him." But Jonathan, her grip tightened on his hand. "I'm afraid." The admission stunned him. In 30 years of marriage, Through childbirth and illness, financial hardship, and natural disasters, he had never heard Eleanor confess to fear. She had always been the family's emotional anchor, steady and resolute in the face of whatever challenges life presented. He squeezed her hand. Thomas believes his device may be responsible. He's dismantling it as we speak. A faint smile touched her lips. Always so brilliant, our Thomas. Too brilliant for his own good, perhaps. She paused, gathering strength. Have you checked on Sarah? Jonathan hesitated. Their youngest had been moved to her own bedroom upstairs, partly to give Eleanor peace to rest, but partly because the child's transformation was perhaps the most disturbing of all. I'm going there next, he assured her. She'll need you to be strong, Eleanor said. We all will. Jonathan pressed a kiss to his wife's forehead, then made his way upstairs. The door to Sarah's room was ajar, and he could hear soft sobbing from within. He steeled himself before entering. The young woman sitting at the window barely resembled the 11-year-old girl who had excitedly announced the arrival of guests just 2 days ago. Sarah Whitmore now appeared to be in her early 20s, her childish features replaced by the defined angles of adulthood, her slight frame filled out into womanly curves that her girl's night dressed to contain. Papa, she said when she noticed him, her voice deeper, but still recognizably Sarah's. What's happening to me? Jonathan crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. They were a woman's hands now, not a child's. The fingers longer, the bones more pronounced beneath skin that had lost its childish softness. We're gonna fix this, Sarah. Thomas is working on a solution. I don't understand. She sobbed, tears streaming down a face that had matured a decade in the span of 2 days. I went to sleep a little girl and woke up like this. I don't know how to be this person, Papa. I don't know how to be grown. The raw confusion and fear in her voice broke Jonathan's heart. Children were supposed to grow up gradually with time to adjust to each new phase of development. Sarah had been robbed of that natural progression, thrust into physical maturity, while her mind remained that of a child. You're still you, Jonathan assured her, fighting to keep his voice steady. No matter what happens to your body, you're still my Sarah, and we will find a way through this together as a family. She nodded, trying to be brave, even as fresh tears welled in her eyes. Thomas will fix it, won't he? He's so smart. He can fix anything. Jonathan wished he could share her childlike faith in her brother's abilities. He's certainly trying his best, he said, which was as much commitment as he dared make. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the Whitmore property, Thomas remained in his workshop, frantically documenting every aspect of his device. His hands, now showing the first signs of age spots, moved with practiced precision as he sketched diagrams and filled notebook pages with calculations. It has to be reversible, he muttered to himself, running a hand through hair that now showed distinct gray at the temples. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. If time can be accelerated, it must be possible to decelerate it as well. The scientific principles that had guided Thomas throughout his life offered him a slender thread of hope in this desperate situation. In every natural system he had studied, balance was the fundamental law. For every force, a counterforce. For every action, a reaction. If his device had somehow pushed 14 people forward through time, there must be a way to pull them back. The door to the barn creaked open, and Thomas looked up to see his brother James entering. Unlike Thomas, who had always been slight of build with a scholar's pore, James Whitmore was the image of their father. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the powerful hands and weathered complexion of a man who spent his days working the land. At 31, he was the eldest Whitmore son and had always taken his responsibilities as such seriously, acting as his father's right hand in managing the estate. "Father sent me to check on your progress," James said, his expression grim. Unlike Thomas, he showed no signs of the aging affliction. His 31 years sat naturally on his features, not the 40-plus that Thomas now appeared to be. "I'm nearly finished," Thomas replied, gesturing to the pages of notes and diagrams spread across his workbench. The lantern light cast his features in sharp relief, emphasizing the new lines that had formed around his eyes and mouth. "But James, I think I might be able to reverse this." If I can reconfigure the device to create an inverse harmonic. No. James's voice was firm as he strode forward, his boots heavy on the barn's wooden floor. He placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, his grip tight enough to convey the seriousness of his words. No more experiments, Thomas. Father was clear. The device is to be destroyed tonight. But if I'm right, this could be our only chance to look at what your meddling has already done. James's composure cracked, his voice rising in anger as he gestured broadly toward the main house. Mother looks 70 instead of 50. Little Sarah is a woman grown overnight. William barely recognizes himself. His hand dropped from Thomas's shoulder, forming a fist at his side. And for what? So you could play at being a great scientist? So you could impress some European correspondent with your brilliance? Thomas flinched as if struck, his brother's words cutting deeper than any physical blow could have. The accusation stung all the more because it contained a kernel of truth. He had been so consumed by the intellectual challenge of his work, so eager to prove the validity of his theories that he hadn't fully considered the potential consequences of manipulating forces he didn't fully understand. That wasn't my intention, he said quietly, the defense sounding hollow even to his own ears. I never thought. That's always been your problem, brother. You never think about the consequences of your actions. James stepped closer to the device, eyeing it with naked hostility. This ends tonight. Thomas moved to stand between his brother and the device, a protective gesture born of both scientific curiosity and desperate hope. Just give me until morning, he pleaded, spreading his hands in supplication. One night to attempt a reversal. If it doesn't work, I'll destroy it myself. I swear. James hesitated, the bond of brotherhood warring with his fear and anger. In the lantern light, Thomas could see the conflict play across his brother's face. The same face that had watched over him during childhood illnesses, that had taught him to fish in Maple Creek, that had defended him against schoolyard bullies who mocked his intellectual pursuits. You have until dawn, James finally conceded, though his expression remained stern. But I'm staying to watch. No more solitary experiments. Thomas nodded, relief washing over him. Thank you. I'll need your help anyway. The calibrations will be delicate in my hands. He held them up, showing how they now trembled slightly. Another sign of the premature aging that had overtaken him. The brothers worked through the night, the silence between them gradually giving way to a cautious collaboration as Thomas explained the principles behind his device and James offered practical solutions to mechanical challenges. It was a dynamic familiar from their childhood. Thomas providing the theoretical framework, James the pragmatic execution. Together they had once built a working water wheel for the creek that ran through the eastern portion of the Whitmore property. Thomas designing the mechanism while James constructed it with his superior carpentry skills. Now, with far more at stake than a boyhood project, they fell into that old pattern. Thomas would explain what needed to be done, recalibrating the crystal alignments, reversing the polarity of certain components, adjusting the pendulum swing to create a countering frequency. And James would implement these changes with steady hands and methodical precision. As they worked, the condition of the afflicted Whiters continued to worsen. Eleanor now appeared to be in her 70s. Her once nimble fingers gnarled with arthritis. Catherine, who had been 62, now looked well into her 80s, her mind increasingly confused, and her breathing labored. Most concerning were the children. Sarah had stabilized somewhat, her appearance now that of a woman in her early 20s. But young William, who had been 7, now looked like a teenager, his child's mind struggling to comprehend the changes in his body. The disconnection between his physical development and his emotional maturity had sent him into a state of bewildered distress that no amount of comfort from his parents could alleviate. By midnight, the mood in the main house had grown desperate. Dr. Fleming had sent for additional colleagues from Knoxville, but they were not expected to arrive before the following afternoon. The Nashville doctor had departed hours earlier, claiming he needed to consult his medical texts, though Jonathan suspected the man was simply fleeing what he couldn't understand. Jonathan sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him. Through the window, he could see the light still burning in the barn where his sons worked. A part of him wanted to join them to oversee their efforts, but he knew his place was here with Elelaner and the others. His scientific knowledge was limited. He would be of little use to Thomas and James, but he could provide comfort and stability to the family members who looked to him for strength in this crisis. A soft knock at the door roused him from his thoughts. "Enter," he called, expecting one of the servants who had remained to help care for the family. Instead, it was Mary who appeared, her pregnant belly preceding her through the doorway. Despite the late hour, she was still fully dressed, though her hair had begun to escape its pins, giving her a slightly disheveled appearance that spoke of the long, stressful day. She moved with the careful deliberation of a woman in her third trimester, one hand habitually supporting her lower back. "I've just checked on everyone," she reported, lowering herself carefully into the chair across from Jonathan's desk. "They're resting as comfortably as can be expected." Jonathan nodded wearily. "Thank you, Mary. You should be resting yourself in your condition." She smiled faintly as she adjusted her position, seeking comfort that was increasingly elusive as her pregnancy progressed. "I doubt I could sleep even if I tried." She paused, one hand moving in slow circles over her belly. "The baby is restless tonight. Perhaps he senses the disturbance in the household." Jonathan managed a small smile at that. "He or she," Mary amended with a tired shrug. "James is convinced it's another boy, but I'm not so certain." Her expression grew more serious. "Jonathan, I've been thinking about something Thomas said earlier about the device affecting the flow of time." "What of it?" "Well, not everyone in the household has been affected." As he hurried across the moonlit yard toward the barn, Jonathan felt the first stirring of hope since the nightmare had begun. If distance could provide protection, perhaps there was a way to shield the entire family. While Thomas attempted his reversal, the interior of the barn was transformed. Thomas had rearranged his device, the crystal rods now pointing inward rather than outward. The strange symbols on the base partially obscured by new markings drawn in what looked uncomfortably like blood. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting multiple overlapping shadows that danced across the walls as the brothers moved around the workshop. "Thomas, James?" Jonathan called, stepping carefully around tables laden with tools and papers. James emerged from behind the device, his face smudged with dirt and his eyes red from fatigue. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of farm work, now smeared with oil and dust from his mechanical labors. "Father, we've made progress." "Thomas believes he can create a temporal inversion," James explained, gesturing to where his brother hunched over a journal, scribbling furiously. Despite the initial skepticism he had shown, James now spoke with a cautious optimism, a reversal of the energy flow that caused the aging. Jonathan approached his younger son, noticing how Thomas's shoulders hunched with a stoop that hadn't been there even that morning. The physical changes were progressing at an alarming rate. If they couldn't find a solution soon, there might be nothing left of the Thomas they knew. "I've worked out the mathematics," Thomas added without looking up, his pen continuing its frantic dance across the page. Complex equations filled the journal, interspersed with diagrams that would have been incomprehensible to anyone without Thomas's unique understanding. "The principle is sound, but there's a risk." "What risk?" Jonathan demanded, moving closer to peer at the modified device. The crystals seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, though it might have been merely a trick of the lanterns. Thomas finally raised his head. In the harsh lantern light, the aging was even more pronounced than Jonathan had realized. His son now looked to be in his late 40s, his hairline receding, lines deeply etched around his mouth. Only his eyes remained unchanged, the same intense, intelligent gaze that had always set Thomas apart. "If my calculations are incorrect, the reversal could accelerate the aging rather than reverse it. In the worst case, the inversion could." He hesitated, clearly reluctant to voice the most terrible possibility. It could age everyone to dust in an instant. A heavy silence fell over the barn. The only sounds were the occasional stamp of a horse in its stall and the distant hooting of an owl hunting in the fields. The weight of responsibility seemed to press down on all three men, but most heavily on Thomas, who had created the device that now threatened his family's existence. There must be another way, Jonathan finally said, unwilling to gamble with the lives of his family on such uncertain odds. Mary has a theory about distance providing protection from the effects. Perhaps if we move everyone far enough away. It's too late for that, Thomas interrupted, setting down his pen and rubbing his eyes, which seemed to have sunken deeper into their sockets in just the hours since Jonathan had last seen him. The process has already begun in the affected individuals. Distance might prevent new cases, but it won't help those already suffering. He gestured to himself, the evidence of his argument visible in his prematurely aged face. The temporal alteration has been initiated at the cellular level that IT will continue regardless of location unless we can actively reverse it. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. This is our only chance, Father. Jonathan felt the weight of the decision pressing down upon him. 19 lives, his family, his blood hanging in the balance. If he refused Thomas's solution, they would continue to age at this accelerated rate, their lives effectively over in a matter of days or weeks. If he approved it, they risked an even more terrible fate. How certain are you that this will work? He asked his son, studying Thomas's face for any sign of doubt or deception. Thomas met his gaze steadily. There was no false confidence there, no reckless enthusiasm. Instead, Jonathan saw the measured assessment of a mind capable of weighing complex variables and drawing sound conclusions, even when the stakes were unimaginably high. I believe in the science, Thomas replied with quiet conviction. The mathematics are sound. The principles of temporal inversion follow logically from what we've observed in the original acceleration. But we're in uncharted territory, Father. No one has ever attempted anything like this before. He spread his hands in a gesture of honesty. I can offer hope, not certainty. Jonathan turned to James. And you? You've seen his work. What do you think? James hesitated, glancing at the modified device with a mixture of distrust and grudging respect. He had always been the practical one, suspicious of Thomas's theoretical pursuits. But now, having worked alongside his brother through the night, he had gained a new appreciation for the rigorous thinking behind Thomas's seemingly fantastical ideas. That I don't pretend to understand all of Thomas's theories, he said finally. The mathematics are beyond me, and talk of temporal energy still sounds like something from a dime novel, but I've watched him work tonight with a focus and clarity I've never seen before. If anyone can undo this, it's him. The decision crystallized in Jonathan's mind. The alternative, watching his family wither away, was unthinkable. When will you be ready? Dawn, Thomas replied, turning back to the device. The rising sun provides an additional energy source that could amplify the effect. According to my calculations, the natural electromagnetic fluctuations that occur at daybreak will enhance the inversion process. Then I'll bring everyone here at first light, Jonathan declared, a new determination infusing his voice. Every member of this family will face this together. As the first pale light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern sky, the Whitehursts gathered in the barn. It was a solemn procession, the afflicted, supported by those still healthy, moving slowly across the dew-dampened grass. The sky was strewn with bands of pink and gold, promising another scorching summer day. But for the Whitehursts, the weather was the least of their concerns. They moved with the quiet dignity of people facing an uncertain fate together, bound by blood and by the shared ordeal of the past 3 days. Ella Laner, now resembling a woman in her 80s, leaned heavily on Jonathan's arm. Her once dark hair was completely white, her face a map of deep lines, but her eyes remained bright and determined. She wore her best day dress as though attending church rather than an experimental procedure with unknown consequences. Are you certain about this? Jonathan asked her quietly as they approached the barn. What choice do we have? She replied, her voice thin but resolute. I would rather risk everything on Thomas's brilliance than watch our family wither away day by day. Inside, Thomas had prepared the barn as best he could. Chairs had been arranged in a circle around the device, which now hummed with a low, almost musical tone. The crystal rods glowed faintly, casting prismatic patterns across the wooden walls. In just 3 days, he appeared to have aged 30 years. His movement stiff, his breathing labored. The effect should encompass everyone within this circle. One by one, the family members took their places. Sarah, now looking like a young woman of 21 instead of the 11-year-old child she had been just days ago, helped guide her elderly Aunt Catherine to a chair. William, physically a teenager, but with the frightened eyes of the 7-year-old boy trapped within, clung to his mother's hand. The experiment unfolded as Thomas had planned. With the entire family gathered, he activated the device, and an intense light filled the barn. There was pain, confusion, and fear, but when it ended, each family member had returned to their proper age. Sarah was 11 again. Eleanor's silver had receded, and everyone seemed restored to their normal state. But victory came at a cost. Thomas, who had configured himself as the focal point to absorb the excess temporal energy, paid the ultimate price. Though outwardly restored to his youthful appearance, the strain on his system was too great. Despite his family's desperate efforts to save him, Thomas Whitmore passed away 3 days later. Having sacrificed himself to save those he loved, the Whitmore family buried him beneath the old oak tree where Eleanor's birthday celebration had taken place just 1 week earlier. They never spoke publicly about what had transpired during those 10 extraordinary days in the summer of 1859. But within the family, the story was preserved, passed down through generations as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the power of sacrifice. Jonathan kept his promise to his son. Thomas's journals were carefully preserved, though it would be nearly a century before science advanced enough for his theories to be fully appreciated. By then, the Whitmore name had become associated with scientific innovation. As Thomas's descendants, inspired by his legacy, made their own contributions to humanity's understanding of the natural world. And on the Whitmore estate, a tradition began that continues to this day. Each year, as summer gives way to autumn, the family gathers beneath the ancient oak where Thomas lies buried. As the sun sets, casting long shadows across the rolling Tennessee hills, they light 19 candles, one for each member of the family whose time was nearly stolen, and one for the young man who gave his future so that they might have theirs. For the Whiters understand what most never learn, that time is the most precious commodity of all, not to be taken for granted, nor to be tampered with. Each moment is a gift, each day a treasure beyond measure, and sometimes the most profound wisdom comes at the highest price. In Maplewood, Tennessee, locals still tell stories about the summer when time itself seemed to bend around the Whitmore estate. Most dismiss it as folklore, a tale grown fantastic with each retelling. But those with Whitmore blood know better. They know that in the delicate balance of natural forces, every action has its consequence. They know the true cost of 19 lives restored. They know that time once spent can never truly be reclaimed. But perhaps in the quiet moments when the past seems to whisper through the present, they also know something else. That love, the kind that would sacrifice everything for family, is the one force powerful enough to transcend even time itself. And in that knowledge, perhaps Thomas Whitmore's greatest legacy lies.